My wife got a $36 million deal and threw me out in a winter storm until she begged me to save her career. That night in Nashville, when Lauren raised her glass celebrating the multi-million deal, I was pushed out of the house like excess baggage, and the door locked shut just as the ice wind howled. No car, no battery, just freezing air cutting into my skin and rescue sirens fading in the distance. I thought I had just lost everything until an urgent email appeared, linking her name directly to a review she had never anticipated. A few days later, the person who had thrown me out into the blizzard was on her knees begging me, but the price to save her would leave her career standing on the edge of collapse. Before we continue with Malcolm, smash that like button and subscribe so you don't miss drama stories like this. And tell me in the comments, are you watching from Tennessee, Texas, Mississippi, or Louisiana? I'm always curious about my audience. Now let's see how Malcolm faces this terrifying ice storm night. Malcolm Reed stood in the corner of their downtown Nashville home, watching his wife command the room like she owned the world. Lauren's laughter echoed off the windows as she held court with three executives on the video call, their faces glowing from the wall-mounted screen. The champagne bottle sat empty on the granite counter, and she'd already opened a second. 36 million, gentlemen, she said, raising her glass toward the camera. Clean, locked, and delivered ahead of schedule. The men on screen applauded, their expensive receipts making it clear these weren't just colleagues. They were the kind of people who moved mountains with signature lines. Malcolm stepped forward, hoping to catch her eye, maybe share in this moment that should have belonged to both of them. He'd been the one listening to her practice pitches at 2 a.m, bringing her coffee during endless preparation sessions. Congratulations, Lauren. This is incredible. His voice carried genuine pride, but something cold flickered across her face. The executives on screen glanced at each other, and Malcolm felt the temperature drop. Lauren's smile tightened into something that barely qualified as pleasant. Thank you, she said, her tone suggesting he'd interrupted something important. The words came out like she was addressing hired help. Maybe we should celebrate together, Malcolm continued, ignoring the warning signs. I could open that bottle of... Lauren cut him off with a wave of her hand, not even looking in his direction. Gentlemen, you'll have to excuse the interruption. Some people don't understand professional boundaries. The words hit like physical blows, each one calculated for maximum impact. The executives shifted from polite confusion to uncomfortable recognition. They were witnessing something ugly, and Malcolm felt his face burn with humiliation. One of them, a silver-haired man in what looked like a Chicago office, actually winced and looked away. Lauren's voice took on the sweet, patronizing tone she'd perfected during their 8-year marriage. Honey, this is grown-up business. Maybe you could find something else to do. The dismissal was surgical in its precision, designed to cut deep while maintaining plausible deniability. She'd done this before, always with witnesses, always with that same smile that said she was being reasonable while the knife twisted. Malcolm felt his hands clench, but kept his voice steady. Lauren, we need to talk. Privately. The word carried weight, a final attempt to salvage some dignity, but dignity wasn't something she was interested in preserving, his or her own. Actually, no. Lauren's voice turned arctic, and she finally looked directly at him. You're embarrassing me. You're making me look bad in front of important people, and I won't tolerate it anymore. The executives shifted uncomfortably, but none ended the call. They were getting a front row seat to something that felt like a public execution. Malcolm's throat tightened, but he managed to keep his voice level. These are people who matter to you, I get it, but I'm your husband. The words came out quieter than intended, carrying years of accumulated small humiliations. Lauren's expression didn't soften, it hardened further. Without breaking eye contact, Lauren reached into her purse and pulled out her keychain. The silver house key caught the light as she tossed it onto the marble floor between them, where it landed with a sharp clink that echoed in the sudden silence. Find somewhere else to be tonight. I need space to think, and you need to figure out whether you want to be part of my success or keep dragging me down. Her words carried the weight of ultimatum, but Malcolm heard something else underneath. She'd already made her decision. The executives were still watching, their faces a mixture of fascination and horror. Gentlemen, where were we? Malcolm stared at the key on the floor, feeling something fundamental shift inside his chest. This wasn't about space or thinking time. This was about power and humiliation and making sure he understood his place in her new world order. The weather alert chimed from the television, something about an ice storm warning for Middle Tennessee, but it felt distant compared to the cold settling into his bones. He could pick up the key, apologize, retreat like a scolded child. Instead, he walked toward the door, his footsteps silent on the hardwood. Lauren was already deep in conversation about market projections, her voice animated and confident. She'd moved on from him so quickly it was like he'd never been there. Malcolm paused at the threshold and looked back one last time. The key still lay where she'd thrown it, abandoned and forgotten. Outside, the wind rattled the windows with increasing urgency. The temperature display read 18 degrees and falling, but the air inside felt even colder. He stepped onto the front porch and heard the deadbolt click behind him. The front porch felt like stepping into a freezer after the warmth of their home, but Malcolm barely noticed the initial chill compared to what he'd just left behind. His breath came out in small puffs as he walked down the front steps, each descending step marking the distance between him and the life he thought he knew. The sidewalk's concrete echoed his footsteps as he moved toward the street, and Nashville's winter night hit him like a physical assault. The wind carried ice crystals that stung his face, and his lightweight jacket, perfectly adequate for walking from car to building, felt like tissue paper against the storm that was building momentum across Middle Tennessee. His phone buzzed with emergency alerts as he stood on the sidewalk, trying to process what had just happened. Ice storm warning, avoid all unnecessary travel, power outages expected, temperatures dropping to dangerous levels. The words scrolled across his screen in stark white text, but they felt abstract compared to the reality of standing outside with nowhere to go. His Uber app showed a message that made his stomach drop. Due to severe weather conditions, rides are temporarily unavailable in your area. 3 taxis passed without slowing, their drivers probably heading home before the roads became impassable. Malcolm's breath created clouds that the wind immediately tore apart, and he could already feel his fingertips going numb inside his thin gloves. The first place he tried was the Mapco station 6 blocks away, its neon sign a beacon of hope in the growing storm. But when he arrived, lungs burning from the cold air, he found the attendant locking up early. "Sorry, man," the young guy said, not unkindly. "District manager called. Told us to close before the roads ice over completely. You need to get somewhere safe." Malcolm nodded and turned back into the wind, his phone battery dropping to 15% as the cold sapped its power. The temperature wasn't just falling, it was plummeting with the kind of speed that turned ordinary winter nights into life-threatening emergencies. Every car that passed seemed to be heading away from downtown, evacuating before the worst hit. Walking became increasingly treacherous as the storm intensified. The sidewalks turned into sheets of black ice, forcing Malcolm to shuffle rather than walk, his dress shoes offering no traction whatsoever. Twice he nearly fell, catching himself on parked cars that were already developing thick shells of ice. The streetlights created halos in the swirling precipitation, but they also illuminated just how alone he was out here. Emergency vehicles wailed in the distance, their sirens Dopplering past as they responded to accidents and stranded motorists. Malcolm's hands were too stiff to operate his phone properly, the touchscreen barely registering his numb fingers as he tried to search for nearby shelters. The warming center at Mount Olivet Methodist Church appeared like salvation after 40 minutes of desperate wandering. The red brick building glowed with warm yellow light, and Malcolm could see people moving around inside through the frosted windows. Mrs. Johnson, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and capable hands, met him at the door with a cup of hot coffee and a wool blanket that smelled like industrial detergent and hope. "You're lucky you found us," she said, studying his face with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen plenty of people at their lowest points. "Temperature's supposed to hit single digits tonight, and the wind's making it feel like 20 below." Inside, the church basement hummed with quiet activity as volunteers distributed cots and hot meals to about 30 people seeking shelter from the storm. Malcolm found himself sitting next to an elderly man named Robert, who'd been living in his car until it broke down 3 days ago. "Weather like this, don't care how much money you got in the bank," Robert observed, wrapping his hands around a steaming bowl of soup. "Cold'll kill you just the same whether you're wearing a $1,000 suit or clothes from the Goodwill bin." The words carried a wisdom that cut through Malcolm's fog of shock and self-pity. Around them, families with children tried to make sleeping arrangements on narrow cots, while teenagers huddled together near the space heaters. Malcolm's phone, plugged into a power strip someone had thoughtfully set up near the coffee station, finally had enough charge for him to make a call. His brother Marcus in Memphis answered on the second ring, his voice thick with sleep and immediately alert when he heard Malcolm's situation. "Jesus, Malcolm, are you serious? She just threw you out?" The conversation was brief but grounding. Marcus offering his couch, his car, his spare bedroom, anything Malcolm needed to get back on his feet. "Don't you dare go back there tonight," Marcus said firmly. "Man's got to have some self-respect. You can figure out the rest tomorrow when your head's clear and you're not freezing to death." As Malcolm settled onto his assigned cot, listening to the wind howl against the church's windows and the quiet conversations of people whose circumstances were far worse than his own, he made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. He wouldn't be calling Lauren. He wouldn't be knocking on that front door, hat in hand, begging for forgiveness for crimes he hadn't committed. Mrs. Johnson had given him a pamphlet about transitional housing and job placement services, treating him with the same dignity she'd shown everyone else who'd walked through those doors. "Pride's a luxury most folks can't afford," she'd said quietly. "But self-respect? That's something nobody can take from you unless you let them." His phone buzzed with an email notification as the church settled into the rhythm of an emergency shelter. The Wi-Fi signal was weak but functional, and Malcolm squinted at the screen as a message loaded with unusual urgency. The subject line made him sit up straighter on his cot. "Urgent, compliance review, needed, read partnership, deal." The sender was someone he recognized from the Tennessee Business Ethics Board, and the timestamp showed it had been sent just 20 minutes ago. Malcolm's expertise in risk assessment had apparently caught up with him in the most unexpected way, at the exact moment when Lauren thought she had everything locked down tight. The irony wasn't lost on him as he stared at the email in the dim light of the warming center. The email's blue glow illuminated Malcolm's face in the dim warmth of the church basement, and for the first time in hours, he felt something other than humiliation coursing through his veins. The message was from Maria Rivera, Chief Ethics Officer for the Tennessee Business Ethics Board, and her words carried the weight of official authority. "Malcolm, we need your assessment on the Meridian-Patterson Partnership Agreement executed today. Standard conflict of interest review per state regulations. Deadline Friday morning, files attached." The irony was so sharp it almost made him laugh. Lauren's $36 million triumph was about to land on his desk for professional scrutiny. Malcolm had spent 3 years building his reputation as one of Tennessee's most thorough compliance reviewers, specializing in partnership agreements and vendor relationships for state-regulated industries. His work wasn't glamorous, but it was essential, the kind of behind-the-scenes expertise that kept major deals legal and above board. Lauren had always dismissed it as paperwork pushing, never understanding that his methodical approach to risk assessment prevented companies from walking into regulatory disasters. She'd made him feel small for choosing steady professionalism over flashy deal-making, but tonight that same professionalism was about to become her biggest problem. The files downloaded slowly over the church's Wi-Fi, but Malcolm's mind was already shifting into analytical mode. Partnership agreements this size required extensive documentation, disclosure statements, and conflict of interest certifications. If Lauren had cut corners or overlooked requirements in her rush to close the deal, his review would uncover those gaps with surgical precision. The reviewing board would have no choice but to act on any significant violations, regardless of personal relationships or financial stakes involved. Robert, the elderly man on the next cot, noticed Malcolm's sudden change in demeanor. "Good news?" he asked, his voice carrying gentle curiosity. Malcolm looked up from his phone, realizing he'd been staring at the screen for several minutes. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Might be the kind of news that changes everything." Robert nodded with wisdom born from hard times, but Malcolm felt a strange calm settling over him that had nothing to do with the warm shelter and everything to do with purpose. As the preliminary documents loaded, Malcolm recognized the structure immediately. Meridian Industries partnering with Patterson Development for a mixed-use project requiring state environmental clearances and federal tax incentives. Lauren's signature appeared on multiple pages as the primary relationship manager, certifying compliance with disclosure requirements. Her confident handwriting looked exactly the same as it had on their marriage certificate 8 years ago. But now those flourishes might represent something far more dangerous than romantic optimism. The deeper Malcolm dug into the documentation, the more questions began forming. Partnership agreements of this magnitude typically involved multiple rounds of vendor selection, with clear paper trails showing how relationships were established. But some of the supporting documentation felt thin, almost perfunctory, as if someone had been more focused on speed than thoroughness. The disclosure forms were properly signed and notarized, but they lacked detailed explanation that would satisfy a careful reviewer. Malcolm's trained eye began picking up inconsistencies, small gaps that might mean nothing or might indicate someone had been less than completely transparent. Mrs. Johnson appeared beside his cot with another cup of coffee. "You don't have to work tonight, honey. Whatever's on that phone can wait until morning." But Malcolm shook his head, already too deep in the analysis to stop. "This actually can't wait," he said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Sometimes timing is everything. And if I'm reading this situation correctly, timing might be the only advantage I have left." She studied his face, recognizing something that spoke of professional competence rather than personal desperation. The name that stopped him cold, it appeared buried in a vendor list on page 47, Damon Pierce, listed as a consulting contractor for Patterson Development. Malcolm set his coffee down carefully, his hands steadier than they'd been all evening. Damon Pierce, the smooth-talking consultant who'd been calling Lauren's direct line for months, always with urgent project updates that required immediate conversation. The same Damon whose name had appeared on Lauren's phone screen often enough that Malcolm had started noticing the pattern, though he'd never demanded explanations for professional relationships. The pieces were beginning to form a picture that made Malcolm's pulse quicken. If Damon had undisclosed financial interests in the Patterson side of the partnership, and if Lauren had failed to properly vet those relationships during her due diligence process, then her $36 million victory might have been built on a foundation that wouldn't survive serious scrutiny. The compliance review that landed in his email wasn't just bureaucratic routine. It was the kind of deep dive investigation that could unravel carefully constructed business relationships and expose ethical violations with real consequences. Malcolm saved his preliminary notes and leaned back on the narrow cot, listening to the storm rage against the church windows. For the first time since Lauren had thrown those keys at his feet, he felt like himself again. Competent, valuable, and definitely not the weak link in anyone's success story. Tomorrow he would begin the kind of methodical investigation that had built his professional reputation. Tonight he would sleep better than he had in months, despite the thin mattress and the sounds of 30 other people seeking shelter from the cold. The irony was perfect, and perfectly just. Malcolm arrived at the Tennessee Business Ethics Board offices at 7:30 in the morning, 2 hours before the building officially opened to the public. The storm had passed during the night, leaving Nashville encased in a shell of ice that turned the city into a crystalline maze of beauty and danger. His borrowed Honda Civic, courtesy of Marcus, who'd driven up from Memphis at 5 a.m., crunched over the salt-treated parking lot as he made his way toward the limestone building that housed the state's corporate oversight operations. Security guard Tommy Williams recognized him immediately and buzzed him through the employee entrance. "Burning the midnight oil again, Mr. Reed?" Tommy asked with a knowing smile. "Must be something important to get you in here this early after a night like that." The compliance review room on the third floor felt like a sanctuary compared to the warming center. But Malcolm's focus wasn't on comfort. It was on the stack of documents that would determine whether Lauren's career survived the next 72 hours. He spread the Meridian Patterson files across the conference table in methodical order, creating a timeline that stretched from initial contact 6 months ago through yesterday's signature ceremony. The partnership agreement itself was a masterpiece of legal language and financial engineering. But Malcolm wasn't interested in the deal's elegance. He was hunting for the gaps, the inconsistencies, the small details that compliance officers live to discover and corporate executives learn to fear. The first red flag appeared in the vendor selection documentation, where Patterson Development had chosen 3 subcontractors without the competitive bidding process required by Tennessee law for projects receiving state tax incentives. The selections weren't illegal. There were legitimate exceptions for specialized expertise, but they required additional disclosure forms that Malcolm couldn't locate in Lauren's submission package. More troubling was the pattern he began noticing in the timeline. Damon Pierce's consulting company had been retained by Patterson just 2 weeks after Lauren's initial contact with Meridian Industries. suggesting a levy of coordination that went beyond coincidental business relationships. Malcolm pulled up the phone records that Lauren had submitted as part of her standard disclosure package, a routine requirement that most executives barely noticed, since personal calls were explicitly excluded from review. But professional communications were fair game, and the pattern that emerged made Malcolm's coffee grow cold as he studied the data. 47 calls between Lauren's direct line and Damon's cell phone during the 6-month negotiation period, including 12 conversations that lasted longer than 30 minutes. The timing of those calls correlated almost perfectly with major decision points in the partnership negotiations, suggesting a level of collaboration that should have been disclosed if Damon had any financial stake in the outcome. The smoking gun appeared buried in a subsidiary filing that most reviewers might have glossed over, a document showing that Damon Pierce held a 23% stake in a shell company that provided strategic consulting services to Patterson Development's parent corporation. The ownership structure was perfectly legal but deliberately opaque, requiring 3 different database searches to establish the connection. Lauren's disclosure forms contained a standard certification stating that she had no personal or professional relationships that could constitute conflicts of interest in this transaction. If she'd known about Damon's financial ties to Patterson and failed to disclose them, she'd violated Tennessee's ethics regulations in a way that could end her career immediately. Malcolm reached for his phone and dialed Maria Rivera's direct line, knowing she'd be in her office by 8:15 every morning, regardless of weather or workload. "Maria, it's Malcolm Reed. I've got some preliminary findings on the Meridian Patterson review that need immediate attention." Her voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years investigating corporate misconduct. "How immediate are we talking, Malcolm?" Scale of 1 to 10. Malcolm looked at the evidence spread across his table, feeling the weight of what he'd discovered. "About an 8 and climbing. We're looking at potential undisclosed conflicts that could invalidate the entire partnership agreement. I need another 12 hours to document everything properly, but you should probably clear your calendar for tomorrow morning." The documentation process took on a rhythm that Malcolm found almost meditative, photographing relevant pages, cross-referencing databases, building the kind of airtight evidence trail that would survive legal challenges and board scrutiny. Each piece of information confirmed his growing suspicion that Lauren's deal wasn't just ethically questionable, it was legally vulnerable in ways that could expose Meridian Industries to regulatory sanctions and Patterson Development to contract nullification. The irony wasn't lost on him that his professional expertise, the very skills Lauren had dismissed as irrelevant, were about to become the most important factor in determining her future. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Malcolm had assembled a 40-page preliminary report that read like a roadmap to professional disaster for everyone involved in the Meridian-Patterson partnership. His phone had been buzzing with text messages all day, but he'd ignored them while building his case with a thoroughness that had made him Tennessee's most requested compliance reviewer. When he finally glanced at the screen during a coffee break, his blood pressure spiked immediately. 15 missed calls from Lauren, 12 text messages that progressed from confusion to panic to something approaching desperation. The last message, sent just 20 minutes ago, contained only 7 words that changed everything. "Malcolm, please call me. I need you." For the first time in 8 years of marriage, she actually sounded like she meant it. Malcolm let his phone ring through to voicemail for the 16th time before finally answering Lauren's call at 5:47 that evening. Her voice hit him like ice water, not the confident tone she'd used while dismissing him, but something raw and desperate he'd never heard in 8 years of marriage. "Malcolm, where are you? I've been calling all day. Something's happening at work, and I don't understand what's going on." The panic was genuine, but so was the assumption that he'd drop everything to help her clean up whatever mess she'd created. "I'm at the ethics board office," Malcolm said calmly, watching afternoon light reflect off ice-covered windows. "Working." The silence stretched long enough for him to hear her breathing change, shifting from relief to something approaching recognition. When she spoke again, her voice carried a tremor that might have been fear. "The ethics board? Malcolm, what are you doing there?" Her question came out sharp and accusatory, as if his presence represented betrayal rather than normal professional responsibilities. Malcolm set down his pen and leaned back, feeling strange detachment from the conversation. "I'm conducting a compliance review on a partnership agreement executed yesterday." Standard procedure for deals involving state tax incentives. He paused, letting the implications settle. The Meridian-Patterson partnership, specifically. Maria Rivera asked me to handle the assessment personally. Lauren's sharp intake of breath was audible, followed by silence that confirmed everything Malcolm had suspected about her awareness of potential problems. "You can't be serious," Lauren said finally, her voice climbing toward hysteria. "This is insane. You're my husband. There has to be some conflict of interest rule preventing you from reviewing my work." But Malcolm had already checked the regulations, knowing she'd raise this objection. Tennessee ethics law specifically allows spousal review when the reviewer wasn't involved in the original transaction and maintains professional independence. "Since you made it very clear last night that my opinions don't matter to your business decisions, I think we can safely say I've maintained appropriate professional distance." Corporate headquarters had called an emergency meeting that morning, Lauren explained through increasingly panicked words, suspending her from active participation pending the state review. Her voice took on the pleading quality of someone whose world was crumbling faster than they could comprehend. "Malcolm, I need you to tell them everything was done properly. Just one paragraph saying the risks are negligible and this whole nightmare goes away. You know how these things work. Your assessment carries weight. You could save this deal with a single phone call." Malcolm felt something cold and final settle in his chest as he listened to her beg for professional salvation. This wasn't about their marriage or shared history or any lingering affection. This was about damage control and career preservation, delivered with the same calculating tone she'd used to dismiss him as irrelevant 24 hours earlier. "Lauren," he said quietly, "let me ask you something. When you threw me out into that ice storm last night, did you spend even 1 minute worrying about whether I was safe, whether I had somewhere to go, whether I might freeze to death?" The question hung between them like a blade, and Lauren's silence stretched long enough to provide its own answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, more honest than he'd heard in years. "I thought you'd figure something out. You always do." The admission was devastating in its casual cruelty, confirming what Malcolm had suspected about her capacity for concern when it didn't serve her immediate interests. "You thought I'd figure it out," he repeated slowly. "While you celebrated your $36 million triumph, you thought I'd just survive a potentially deadly storm because it was inconvenient for you to care." Lauren's tone shifted back toward manipulative sweetness she'd perfected during their marriage. "Malcolm, honey, we can talk about last night later. Right now, I need you to focus on what's important. My career is on the line here. Everything we've worked for could disappear if this review goes badly." But Malcolm heard the truth embedded in her words. Even facing professional disaster, she couldn't apologize for the cruelty or acknowledge that his safety might have mattered. Her concern was entirely transactional, focused on what he could do for her rather than what she'd done to him. "If I don't help you," Malcolm said, his voice steady despite emotions churning in his chest, "what happens then?" Lauren's answer came without hesitation, confirming his worst suspicions about her relationship with Damon Pierce. "Damon will throw me under the bus to save his own skin. He'll claim I knew about his connections to Patterson and chose not to disclose them. He'll make it look like I was the one hiding information to protect the deal." The conversation ended with Lauren's final, desperate promise to make everything right between them if he'd just save her career first. But Malcolm had already heard enough to understand that her version of making things right would never include genuine accountability for how she'd treated him. As he hung up and returned to his evidence files, he felt something that might have been grief for the marriage that had died the moment she'd chosen humiliation over partnership. The parking garage beneath the Tennessee Business Ethics Building smelled like motor oil and winter salt, its concrete walls echoing with the drip of melting ice from the overnight storm. Malcolm stood beside his borrowed Honda Civic at 8:15 Thursday morning, watching his breath form clouds in the frigid air, while he waited for the meeting that would determine Lauren's professional future. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows between the support pillars, creating a setting that felt more like an interrogation scene than the boardroom confrontations Lauren was accustomed to commanding. His phone had been buzzing with increasingly desperate messages since 6 a.m., but he'd stopped reading them after the fifth variation of, "We need to talk immediately." The click of high heels on concrete announced Lauren's arrival before he saw her, the sound echoing off the low ceiling with sharp precision. She emerged from the stairwell looking nothing like the confident executive who dismissed him 2 nights ago. Her usually perfect hair showed signs of hasty styling, and her designer coat couldn't hide the tension in her shoulders or the exhaustion around her eyes. The BMW X5 she'd been driving sat in a visitor spot 30 feet away, its pristine black paint a stark contrast to the salt-stained economy cars that filled the employee section. "Malcolm." Her voice carried none of its usual authority, just a breathless quality that suggested she'd been rehearsing this conversation during the drive downtown. "Thank God you're here. We need to talk before you go upstairs." She moved toward him with the calculated urgency of someone who had identified their last remaining lifeline and was determined not to let it slip away. But Malcolm noticed something in her approach that felt different from the woman who'd thrown keys at his feet, a hesitation that suggested she finally understood that her usual tactics might not work. "Good morning, Lauren," Malcolm replied, his voice carrying the professional courtesy he'd use with any other subject of an ethics investigation. The formal tone seemed to hit her like cold water, and he watched her recalibrate her approach in real time. She stopped just close enough for conversation, but far enough away that their interaction couldn't be mistaken for intimacy, the distance between them feeling carefully calculated rather than natural. Lauren's composure cracked just enough for him to see the desperation underneath. "Malcolm, please. I know things got heated the other night, and maybe I said some things I shouldn't have. But you have to understand, this review could destroy everything I've worked for, everything we've worked for." The plea came packaged in the language of partnership, but Malcolm heard the fundamental dishonesty in her words. She'd made it clear that his contributions were negligible. Now she was trying to claim joint ownership of her success only because she needed his professional expertise to survive. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Malcolm asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Lauren glanced around the garage as if checking for witnesses, then stepped closer with the conspiratorial air of someone about to propose something questionable. "The compliance review is just a formality, right? You've seen the documentation. Everything was handled properly. And all you have to do is write up a clean assessment saying there are no significant risks, and this whole nightmare disappears. One paragraph, Malcolm. That's all it would take." Malcolm studied her face, seeing the calculation behind the desperation. She wasn't asking him to lie exactly. She was asking him to ignore the problems he'd uncovered and provide the kind of superficial review that would allow her deal to proceed without deeper scrutiny. "And if I don't?" he asked quietly. Lauren's mask slipped completely, revealing the panic she'd been trying to hide. "Then Damon throws me under the bus. He's already positioning himself to claim that I misrepresented the disclosure requirements. He'll say I knew about his Patterson connections and chose to hide them because I was more interested in closing the deal than following proper procedures." The admission confirmed everything Malcolm had suspected about Lauren's relationship with Damon Pierce and her awareness of the ethical violations embedded in her deal, but it also revealed something else. She genuinely believed that Malcolm would compromise his professional integrity to save her career, even after she'd humiliated him and left him to face a dangerous storm alone. "Lauren," he said, his voice carrying a sadness that surprised them both, "do you actually think I would sacrifice my professional reputation to cover up your mistakes?" "You're my husband," Lauren responded without hesitation, as if the question itself was absurd. "That's what husbands do. They protect their wives when things go wrong. This is just business, Malcolm. It's not like anyone would get hurt." But Malcolm heard the fundamental misunderstanding embedded in her words. She still didn't grasp that professional ethics weren't negotiable, that his integrity wasn't a commodity she could trade for her convenience, that marriage didn't create an obligation to participate in regulatory violations. "I'll give you a choice," Malcolm said, pulling out his phone to check the time. "You can walk into that hearing room and tell the truth about everything: your relationship with Damon, his undisclosed financial interests, the shortcuts you took to close the deal quickly, take responsibility, cooperate with the investigation, and maybe you can salvage something from this situation." Lauren's face went pale as she processed the implications. "Or you can maintain that everything was handled properly, and I'll present my findings exactly as the evidence supports them. But I won't compromise my professional assessment to save your career." The choice between truth and consequences had never been presented to her so starkly, and Malcolm watched her struggle with the realization that her husband, The man she dismissed as irrelevant now held her professional future in his hands. The irony wasn't lost on either of them as they stood in the fluorescent-lit garage, surrounded by the unglamorous reality of government work that had always seemed beneath her notice. Above them, the Tennessee Business Ethics Board was convening the meeting that would determine whether Lauren's $36 million triumph would survive the morning. The Tennessee Business Ethics Board hearing room felt like a courtroom without the formality, its polished oak table reflecting the morning light that streamed through tall windows overlooking downtown Nashville. Malcolm took his seat at the head of the conference table, his compliance review binder organized with the methodical precision that had made him the state's most trusted ethics investigator. Maria Rivera sat to his right, her expression neutral but alert as she reviewed the agenda. Lauren entered 10 minutes later, flanked by a corporate attorney whose expensive suit couldn't quite mask his obvious discomfort with the situation they were facing. Damon Pierce arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, his confidence intact despite the circumstances that had brought them together. He wore a tailored navy blazer that suggested success without ostentation, and his handshake with Malcolm carried practiced firmness of someone accustomed to managing difficult conversations. "Mr. Reed, I understand you're conducting the compliance review on our partnership agreement. I appreciate the thoroughness of the process." His words were carefully chosen to suggest cooperation while establishing his position as a reasonable participant rather than a subject under investigation. Malcolm opened his binder and began presenting his findings with dispassionate clarity that had earned him respect throughout Tennessee's corporate community. The Meridian-Patterson Partnership Agreement contains several elements that require additional scrutiny under state ethics regulations. Specifically, vendor relationships that may not have been properly disclosed during the initial certification process. His voice carried no personal investment in the outcome, just professional obligation to present facts regardless of their implications for anyone in the room. The first piece of evidence hit Damon like a physical blow, though he managed to maintain his composure as Malcolm detailed the undisclosed financial connections between Pierce Consulting and Patterson Development's parent corporation. "Mr. Pierce, your disclosure forms indicate no financial relationships with Patterson Development, but corporate filings show your consulting firm holds a 23% stake in Strategic Advisory Solutions, which has provided services to Patterson's parent company throughout the negotiation period." The words were delivered without accusation, but their implications hung in the air like smoke. Lauren's attorney leaned forward with aggressive posture, but Damon held up a hand to stop him. His calculated confidence was beginning to show cracks as Malcolm methodically presented phone records, email timestamps, and financial documents that painted a picture of coordination that went far beyond legitimate business relationships. "Those connections were indirect," Damon said carefully, his voice losing some of its earlier assurance. "I didn't consider them material to the partnership negotiations because my role was purely consultative." But Malcolm had anticipated this defense and was ready with documentation that would destroy it completely. Tennessee ethics law requires disclosure of any financial relationship that could reasonably be perceived as creating conflicts of interest, regardless of whether the individual considers them material. He opened a folder containing email exchanges between Damon and Lauren that showed clear coordination of strategy during critical phases of the negotiation process. These communications suggest a level of collaboration that goes beyond consultative services and into active partnership in securing favorable terms for Patterson Development. Lauren sat frozen in her chair as Malcolm presented evidence she'd hoped didn't exist. Records of their private conversations that revealed her awareness of Damon's conflicted position and her decision to proceed without proper disclosure. Her attorney whispered urgently in her ear, but she seemed unable to respond, her usual quick thinking paralyzed by the realization that every defense she'd prepared was crumbling under documented facts. The woman who'd commanded corporate boardrooms with ruthless efficiency looked small and overwhelmed in the face of regulatory scrutiny she'd never imagined would reach her. Maria Rivera asked the questions that Malcolm couldn't pose himself due to his relationship with Lauren, but her inquiries were no less devastating for their professional neutrality. "Mrs. Reed, your certification forms state that you disclosed all potential conflicts of interest. Given the evidence presented regarding Mr. Pierce's financial relationships with Patterson Development, do you maintain that your original disclosures were complete and accurate?" The question offered Lauren a chance to admit error and potentially mitigate consequences, But it also made clear that maintaining her original position would require defending statements that the evidence contradicted. Damon's strategy became apparent as the hearing progressed. He would acknowledge technical violations while positioning Lauren as the primary decision-maker responsible for proper disclosure procedures. I assumed that Ms. Reed would handle all necessary regulatory requirements as the lead relationship manager, he said, his tone suggesting regret while carefully distancing himself from responsibility. My focus was on technical consulting, not compliance oversight. The betrayal was subtle but unmistakable, executed with smooth professionalism of someone who'd calculated the odds and decided to save himself at Lauren's expense. Lauren's voice, when she finally found it, carried none of the authority that had once intimidated Malcolm into silence. I believe that proper disclosures had been made based on the information provided to me, but even her attorney winced at the weakness of the response, and Malcolm felt something that might have been pity as he watched her struggle with a situation that required honesty she'd never learned to practice. The power dynamic that had defined their marriage for 8 years had reversed so completely that Lauren seemed unable to comprehend her new position as the person seeking mercy rather than granting it. Maria Rivera's final statement carried the weight of administrative inevitability. Based on the evidence presented, this board recommends immediate suspension of the Meridian-Patterson Partnership Agreement pending full investigation of disclosure violations and potential regulatory sanctions. The words fell into silence that felt final, ending Lauren's career trajectory with the bureaucratic precision of government oversight that she'd always assumed operated too slowly to affect her world. Malcolm closed his binder and prepared to leave the room where Lauren's $36 million triumph had just become her professional disaster. 1 week after the ethics hearing, Malcolm read the Tennessee Business Ethics Board's final ruling over his morning coffee. Damon Pierce had been permanently removed from the state's approved vendor list and faced federal investigation for his pattern of undisclosed conflicts. Lauren received formal censure, demotion from VP to senior associate, and mandatory completion of 6-month ethics training. The Meridian-Patterson deal was restructured with new oversight requirements, but it survived. Justice had arrived with the bureaucratic efficiency that Lauren had always underestimated. His phone buzzed with a text message that carried none of Lauren's usual commanding tone. "Malcolm, I know I don't deserve your attention, but I need to say something. The night of the ice storm was cruel and unforgivable. I threw you out because I was drunk on success and forgot that you're a human being who deserved basic decency. There's no excuse for what I did, and I'm sorry." The message continued. "You were right to present your findings honestly. I was asking you to compromise your integrity to save my mistakes, and that was wrong. I understand if you never want to see me again." Malcolm stared at the message for several minutes, recognizing genuine accountability for the first time since their marriage had begun its slow decline. This wasn't manipulative apology from someone managing damage control. It was admission of fundamental cruelty she'd previously rationalized as necessary ambition. But acknowledgement of wrongdoing wasn't the same as readiness for the kind of relationship that Malcolm had spent 8 years hoping they might build. His response was brief and direct. "I appreciate the apology. If you want to discuss our future, it starts with marriage counseling or divorce papers. But I won't come back because I'm afraid of your career consequences. And I won't stay because you've learned to say the right words after getting caught. I'll come back when you demonstrate that you value our partnership as much as you value your professional success." Lauren's reply came 3 hours later. "I've already called Dr. Martinez for couples therapy, Tuesdays at 4, starting next week. Will you come?" The request was simple and direct, without the emotional manipulation or deadline pressure that had characterized most of their important conversations. Malcolm found himself cautiously optimistic that professional consequences might have taught her something about the difference between managing people and actually relating to them. The following Tuesday, Malcolm drove toward the therapist's office, passing the corporate towers where Lauren had once wielded influence she'd assumed was permanent. The city looked different now that he understood his own value in professional circles that existed far beyond her particular corner of the business world. His phone had been ringing with job offers from ethics boards in 3 different states, and his reputation for thorough, unbiased investigations had never been stronger. Dr. Martinez's office felt neutral and safe. decorated with soothing colors that encouraged difficult conversations without taking sides. Lauren arrived early and sat quietly while they waited, her usual restless energy replaced by something that looked like genuine reflection. The first session was difficult but productive. She admitted that she'd used professional success to justify personal cruelty, and he acknowledged his role in enabling her behavior by accepting treatment that violated his basic self-respect. After 6 weeks of therapy sessions that slowly peeled back layers of resentment and misunderstanding, Malcolm felt cautiously hopeful about their ability to build something healthier than what they destroyed. But hope wasn't the same as certainty, and self-respect wasn't negotiable regardless of how much progress they made in counseling. Malcolm drove home through Nashville traffic that moved with the patient rhythm of a city that understood both ambition and consequences. The ice storm that had nearly destroyed him had instead revealed strengths he'd forgotten he possessed. Whether his marriage survived or died, he would never again allow anyone to treat his dignity as expendable. The truth had set them both free, even if freedom looked different than either of them had expected. Self-respect isn't negotiable, no matter who's asking you to compromise it. True partnership means valuing each other's dignity even when career ambitions are on the line. What would you have done in Malcolm's position? Would you have saved the deal or saved your integrity? If this story resonated with you, hit that like button and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next video.